Hello, welcome everyone. We are getting all settled and started, ready for today. I am Kendra Loper. I am the Director of Client Services at Veritus Group, and we are so excited to be with you today. And before we dive into a few housekeeping items and introduce our guests, I want to take just a minute to really set the tone for today's conversation. We know that current circumstances, we were just talking about this with our panelists, current circumstances, particularly in the US, are incredibly unpredictable at this time. And many of you may already be experiencing the effects of funding changes. And for a lot of us, this time is just overwhelming. And for some, it may even be feeling quite traumatic. While all of this is on your mind, we want to take this time and space to be one, focused on building community and looking at what's really within our control. We ask that any comments you put in the chat be respectful and focused on the topics we're discussing. With that said, here are a few other items you should know about our webinar system today. Because of the number of participants today, we won't be able to take your questions out loud. So please type them into the question box you'll see there at the bottom of your screen. There's an option to submit your questions anonymously, which you are very welcome to use, and we'll be taking as many questions as possible. So please go ahead and type in these questions as you think of them. Also, we have an international audience on the webinar today, and you're welcome to turn on closed captions if that supports your learning. Lastly, we will be sending you a link to the recording tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that email with the link. Now, I'm thrilled to welcome today's panel, and we're still waiting on one member to join us. We're hoping she'll be able to jump on, but we're going to start with our panel today, and hopefully she'll be able to mix in when she's on. But we're going to start with Jeff Streifels, who is the principal and owner of Veritus Group, and our special guest, Autumn Wush. And so, Jeff, why don't you kick us off with a brief introduction?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. Glad you are with us here. I'm Jeff Streifels, and I'm the principal and owner of Veritus. And I've been doing this for a long time. On the nonprofit side, I worked as a development director for 8 years. And ever since then, I've been working for either at a large agency or at Veritus here. So, so Veritus has been around since really the mid 2000s, 2005 or so. And I'm just really happy that you're with us. This is an important discussion at this time. As Kendra already said, it feels like crazy times sometimes. Every day in the news, it's something different. And I know it's affecting the nonprofit community. And so here we are to talk about that and ask questions and hear what you all are doing. So that said, thank you for being here and look forward to this time with you.
Good. Autumn.
Hey, thank you so much, Jeff and Kendra. I really appreciate your asking me to be here. My name's Autumn Woish, and I'm currently the Executive Director of Membership Fundraising and Donor Relations at KQED. And that is the local San Francisco area NPR and PBS affiliate. We're also a client of Veritus and building the mid-level program, and that's been going really great. And so, I kind of oversee the membership, annual giving, fundraising over there, direct mail, digital fundraising, mid-level fundraising, all of that fun stuff. And then before that, so I've been at KQED for about 4.5 years now. Right before that, I was at Planned Parenthood Northern California, which is the San Francisco local affiliate there. I was there during another uncertain time. So luckily or unluckily, I have some experience in what we're going through nowadays. And just really happy to be here with you all to talk about this important stuff, and look forward to hearing your questions later.
Thanks to both of you. So let me just say today's call, if you've been on some of our prior calls, is going to be a little different than our usual webinars. We're not going to have slides. Instead, we're just going to be talking about some of the most pressing topics that we're hearing about in this ever-changing fundraising environment. To kick things off, we're going to have Autumn and Jeff as well share a little bit about their experiences and some of the strategies that they've been pursuing. Autumn in particular, and what we've been hearing from our clients, Jeff will talk about. So Autumn, let's start with you and just talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing. I know you said you've had some experience, with uncertain times previously. And of course, right now for public media, the spotlight is certainly on your work. So tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, definitely. So, the process started, months ago where I knew that, KQED and its mission was going to be in the spotlight at some point. So I started just throwing together kind of some loose thoughts about what it would take for me to run an emergency response fundraising campaign. So just, rough thoughts, kind of throwing stuff up to, help me focus and help me get less stressed about, what was coming down the pipeline. So that I was able to kind of put it aside for a little bit. And then, a couple months ago, we were notified that the heads of NPR and PBS were asked to appear before Congress. And we were also notified that the FCC was going to be undergoing an investigation into long-held underwriting practices for public media. So those two things, plus just kind of some general tone and tenor talking about the media, I knew that it was time to kind of flesh that plan out and kind of prepare for what was coming. So I did develop a really detailed emergency response plan. So what that would look like. That was how many emails I would send out. Would I be running ads at the same time? What would the content be like? A mixture of, straight communications and fundraising and stewardship pieces. So kind of dusted all of that off. And so that was the detail about the plan, but really the big picture here and what I was focused on is how to be transparent with the donors. And I think, a lot of times, folks are wondering, is it too much? Is it not enough? How do I decide what the right reaction is going to be? And for me, what I really wanted to lean into is how to be completely transparent with donors, to be able to say what we do know is going on and also what we don't know is going on. And that's okay to, respond to donors in this time of uncertainty with just truthfulness. Because ultimately, if times are uncertain for us, we know they're uncertain for our donors as well. And they're looking to nonprofits to really be leaders right now. They want to know that we know what's going on. We have a plan for how we're going to try and approach it, how we're going to protect our important missions. And then ultimately, they want to know how to help, how they can be the partners, that we've built them up to be. So that was really the main goal there. And then we just started executing. So I built it all around, this moment in time, which was the congressional hearings. That was kind of my jumping off point to kind of capture extra, news and attention at the time. And the response has just been incredibly positive. We raised a lot of funds, but we also got a lot of really meaningful donor testimonials in the process, which has been fantastic. And we'll be using, we've shared it out to staff so that they can feel good in this stressful time. And then we'll be using it in communications going forward. And it's one of the stronger campaigns that we've run in recent history. So yeah, that's a little bit of the overview of this wild time.
Yeah.
It is wild. And just a quick note, we've had a couple of questions from our international audience today. Be sure and let us know what, the acronyms mean, FCC, NPR, PBS, all that. There's been some explaining in the chat, but just remember, we've got a few international folks, which is great. We want to make sure they know exactly what we're talking about. But thank you, Autumn. I know there must be so much to to take in, and so much, will we, won't we lose funding, and how do we navigate that? How do we prepare, and how do we best prepare our supporters, our donors, to understand how they can help? So thank you for sharing that. Can you talk a little bit more about your team and how they're feeling about this, added layer of stress during this uncertain time?
Yeah, it definitely is an added layer of stress coming, pretty quickly on the heels of, our most recent end of year campaign. So I'm sure everyone on this feels it too. One of the things, again, it's important to communicate with your donors. It's also hyper important to communicate internally. Things are moving fast and furiously. And making sure that there's kind of like a tight working group for folks to bounce language off of is critical. And one of the main things that I did before embarking on the emergency campaign is to have kind of some real talk with the chief revenue officer, and for her to have with the rest of the executive team. Since I have been through this before, I could easily say, it's going to be rough. I'm going to start this emergency response campaign and I'm going to plan for it to go for a month. But depending on what comes out of hearings or anything else in the news, it could not stop for years. Like, we'll just have to see. And we'll have to be really flexible. One of the other points that I brought up to her, since it's her first time, KQED hasn't been in this situation before, is that, I'm going to propose this fundraising campaign, but it is also going to bring attention to us. And I want the execs to know, sometimes that could be big national attention. And, it's important that legal gets weighed into this so they know, what's coming, what could potentially, come down the wire for us.
Yeah.
And I was able to say, I don't think that's reason enough to not fundraise. But I want you to be aware of all the potential risks, that we could see, or the, extra, legal requests that we might get because of it. And everyone was on board. Everyone was great. I made sure for all language that, the CEO reviewed it. He doesn't typically review my fundraising language, but made sure that he was in on it. He could punt it to legal whenever he needed to. And then for language itself, like drawing that balance in how transparent you are, with folks. Do you want to talk about if federal funding is at risk, how much it means to you? And I'm always of the background that says, donors really look to us for that level of detail and that transparency so that they can help. And we did end up talking about what federal funding meant for KQED, which is great. And so that, I think, is important. There's always a lot of back and forth. I did go back and forth to kind of push on folks to be a little more explicit. When we first started talking about the federal funding risk, I'm going to exaggerate it, but basically it sounded to me like, oh, it's just 7% of KQED's budget, and these other stations have it much worse. And so I had to push pause and say, no, 7% is a lot of funding. And we can't be complacent and make it sound like it wouldn't affect our bottom line. 7% of KQED's funding is $8 million. Like, that's nothing to sneeze at. And the loss of that funding would mean KQED would have to make some really hard decisions. And I don't want to surprise any donors if that were to come down the pike. I want them to know, it's a sizable gap. And yes, absolutely, other stations have it worse. And, we'll still be around as an organization, but really striking that balance, I think, took the longest time in this communication part.
Yeah.
But was critical.
Gosh, incredible.
Autumn, so what I'm hearing is you all had a plan for this, and probably most public media stations have had some kind of pre-thought or plan about what's going to happen. How are we going to deal with this. And I love that you quantified what that gap is, the 7% and what that means, and actually had a plan for how we're going to make that gap up. And I think that's a big thing for everyone listening who does get government funding and it may be either taken away currently or there's a threat, is the first thing to do is to quantify what that gap would be. Whether your food bank, food banks are, for their funding is going away. There's all kinds of nonprofits where their funding is being stripped from government sources. The first thing to do is quantify what that is and be able then, as Autumn has said, be transparent with your donors and give them the opportunity to help close that gap. So identify the gap, then come up with a plan for how you're going to close it through individuals, your private foundations that you have, corporate partners, so that you actually have something in place to do. Because you don't want to be left behind going, I don't know what we're going to do. And so your approach, Autumn, is the right way to do this. Be prepared, know exactly what this is going to mean, and then how are we actually going to make this up? And it's not going to be probably a short-term thing. This is something that's going to be ongoing. You have to think of this as we've lost this now, but it's probably not coming back. Not at least in the next 4 years. And so everyone needs to figure that out, figure out what that gap is. Now, for those organizations that are not affected by government funding, you are affected by by things you can't control, which is the economy, the tariffs, all these things that we can't control. But it's affecting donors, it's affecting you, and your organizations. And again, in Autumn, maybe we've been doing this a long time, but we've been through multiple economic downturns. I know I have in my career. And one of the constant things to think through is not to panic. And to realize you cannot control the economy. You can't control a downturn or a tariff thing. What you can control is making sure you're working your plan, making sure that you're not deaf to what's going on around you, so that donors realize you do hear what's happening. And then also it's in the mid and major gift space, it's really about continuing to build and establish those relationships with donors and understand where they're at. I remember one downturn where this one organization we were working with, they had a lot of donors who were in the who had a lot of stock in the oil industry. And sometime at that point, I can't remember what year it was, the oil prices just sank. And these donors that were giving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year could no longer give anymore. And, it wasn't because the major gift officer did anything wrong, but it was something they couldn't control. What they could control, however, was how they responded to their donors. And they were able to speak to them and make sure they were okay, that, and not make them feel bad that they could no longer give, because these donors were passionate about the mission and felt awful that they had committed, gifts, but they couldn't do it anymore. And it was embarrassing for a lot of donors. But the strategy for the major gift officers was like, hey, don't worry about this. This is okay. We are with you. We still value you as a partner. And I think that's a key for all of you, that if donors have to stop giving less or you start seeing giving going down, letting your donors know that you understand and that this is okay, but that you're with them. So that was some lessons learned. And if you're an executive director, clearly, um, it's easy to panic and let's say, oh, we've got to cut costs at all. And then what happens is you cut costs across the board and then cut the same amount from fundraising as you do programming and all kinds of other areas. Well, fundraising is the area that's bringing in the revenue. So I highly urge you, do not cut your fundraising program if you're feeling the pressure. This is the area that's bringing you revenue, especially on the major gift side. This is now the time to look at how can we deepen those relationships with donors. Or if you don't have a major gift program or a mid-level program, this is a time to actually think about developing that, because these are the relationships you need to start developing. So those are some things that I've learned and have seen kind of going through different periods of economic downturns, and what the nonprofits that were successful, what did they do? They didn't panic. They stayed the course. They doubled down on their relationships that they built with their donors.
That's good. Thank you both for sharing. I think, just trying to understand what is within our control and what feels so out of bounds, but is, clearly impacting not just organizations in the US, but around the globe for sure. And, there's been several questions in the chat here. One in particular I wanted to raise. Jeff, I'll have you start, and Autumn, would love to hear you jump in if you have some thoughts. But can you talk about that donor fatigue around emergency response? So when there is, cuts to federal funding for public media, or there is, some big piece of news that's causing us to panic a little bit and think about what's outside of our control. How have you thought about that donor fatigue around emergency response, and what are your strategies for moving that forward? Jeff, what have you seen nonprofits doing?
Well, this might be unpopular to say this, but I actually don't really believe in donor fatigue. If the donor cares about your mission, and if, as Autumn says, you're being authentic with donors and you're telling them what's happening, they will respond. And of course, not all of them will respond, but those that really care about what's going on and it really truly is an emergency, they will respond to you. And so, again, I think your donors for your organization believe in your mission. And if you're noticing some kind of emergency that's happening and it's legitimate, just like right now, public media stations are putting out essentially an emergency to their donors because there is a legitimate emergency happening with them. Some of these stations are losing millions of dollars, and that could cut into really critical programs that their donors care about. So you want to communicate that and then also think about it as a long-term solution. So there's one thing about emergency, but then what are we going to do going forward? And that's the next thing. After the initial emergency of all of this, the next is, what is our plan moving forward? And being able to convey that to your donors.
Good.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just to tag on to that, I think it's also just looking at the analytics in real time. So when I was creating, this emergency plan, I was planning to send out 11 emails, but not all of them are fundraising. And so that's going to help, not fatigue donors. It's going to engage them, an action alert to get them to do something to help that's not monetary request. And then, I was up to the minute, watching returns on fundraising emails to see if I was noticing a downtrend, and I was not, because I was concerned about that too. There's a lot of critical organizations, in very similar situations right now, and donors have a lot of important organizations to give to. And so, but from what I saw, the revenue was high. Even the last email I sent was one of the highest of the campaign. So I had to decide, do I continue to the campaign for another month? And I decided at that point to kind of put it on pause because I knew we had a planned fundraising campaign in May that I wanted to give folks a little breather from. And so it really is just kind of fast and furious decisions to figure out, are people still being responsive? Are they still reacting to this? And 41% of the donors to my campaign were new or reactivated donors, which is much higher than normal. And what I'm hoping is that I was able to recapture some of the folks who were giving during COVID, who were more emergency response donors. So to recapture some of those folks who typically give during emergency times, as well as keep our current donors happy.
Good, thanks, Autumn. Because you mentioned new donors, I want to lift this question that came. It's really about reaching out to new prospects during this time, and how can you build relationships and deepen relationships with new donors and that you don't really have that long-term history with. What strategies have you used?
Yeah, I can start off on that. For us, it's really just best practices. We have an onboarding series for new donors kind of running throughout the year, so they get to learn about KQED as an organization and what we do. And so it's an educational process. It's like a 3-email campaign. So that works well. We're also being a little more communicative with people during this time. So, in a couple weeks, I'll have an update newsletter going out to folks, here's what happened last month. Here's what's still ahead of us. So they have a little more information. And then if folks are part of mid-level or major gift portfolios, that is a key way to really dig into that. All your donor relations during this time is probably one of the most critical things we can all be doing. Thank you calls, thank you texts are really successful for us as well. And just, we've had a lot of success in the mid-level team of just being a sounding board for questions. A lot of donors have even more questions than the information we put out, and they want to talk to a live person and say, hey, what does this actually mean? Are tariffs going to affect you? Just to be there for whatever questions they have about the impact of their gift at this time.
Good. Okay, let me just jump in here to a few more questions. Jeff, let's start here with you. Would you recommend any kind of event or webinar for major donors, or focus more on that one-to-one relationship?
Well, I would say yes and. So, yeah, as part of an overall strategy for the year for your major donors, you're always trying to build the relationship. So hopefully you have a 12-month communication plan for every one of your major donors that are in your portfolio. And part of that communication plan is, what are those things that you're trying to build those one-to-one relationships? Are you having face-to-face contact? Are you sending information to the donor that are connected to their passions and interests as it relates to all the programs and projects of your organization? Are you inviting them to events that you have to further cultivate that donor relationship? All these kinds of things are ways to bring that donor closer and for you to find out more about that donor. So throughout the course of the year, that's all these different things are definitely touch points that you need to be considering for all of your donors.
Good.
Webinars are a great opportunity. We've seen that work very often. And in fact, it's a great way to invite a community of people to connect with one another. And you can do that via Zoom or webinars like we're doing today. We're bringing together, hundreds of fundraisers around the world talking about, how do we deal with this when there's so much weird stuff going on in the world at the time? Well, and we're having great conversations, and the same thing can be done for your organizations with your donors. and they can be having these kind of conversations and feel part of a community. So it's another touch point to bring them in, feel good about your organization and the fact that you're bringing them together.
Good. Thanks, Jeff. I think, Autumn, I'm going to put this back to you. And I know you spoke to this just a little bit, but maybe you can go a little more specific about, obviously we've known for a while that this public media funding was going to be at risk, that, we've been thinking about it, talking about it. Now it seems more imminent that that will be the case. So how have you thought about your timeline in terms of when do we start communicating with donors? When do we press the emergency button versus, we don't want to cause panic, but how do we think about, the critical work? And at what point did you feel like, okay, this is the right time?
Yeah, definitely. And for me, it was really the announcement of the congressional hearing for the heads of PBS and NPR. So once that date was proposed, I built my whole timeline about that. So, I started, I think, 2 weeks before the congressional hearing was scheduled, started with just an informational email from the CEO about what was happening, and then went into an action alert email about, how folks can contact their congressperson. So at that point, it was very critical. There was a 2-week window before a funding deadline. So it was a real deadline. It wasn't made up. It was something concrete that people could do. And then led into fundraising that kind of culminated the weekend after the congressional hearing. So it was really important to me to not make it just about defunding, even though that was like a critical point, because it's that and more. Like, it was very clear from, how folks are talking about journalism that there were going to be attacks from, all flanks, and, defunding was just one aspect of it. So I wanted to make sure it wasn't so narrowly focused, but targeted and talking about kind of broader risks as well. And then a good example today of, how you have to stay nimble is, I ended my fundraising campaign. We're just in a communications phase for folks now until, our next planned fundraising campaign. But, news broke yesterday that folks are going to propose a clawback of funding. This is something I've seen before, so I knew it was a possibility. It was in the back of my head. But what I did, this morning as I'm going through this article and last night is, think about the timeline. There's a proposed date for when the clawback request is going to happen. So, I literally opened up my calendar, noticed I had a newsletter planned for that day to communicate like what's happened in the last month and what do we have going forward. And, that was my decision. Well, I'm not going to change my strategy now. I'm going to lean into this plan that I have, and I'm just going to make sure that the language is refreshed enough. And then the fundraising campaign that follows, depending on the process with Congress, I'm going to have to be just hyper flexible with my language to see what comes out and if I need to make any last minute language changes. And I'm a huge proponent of writing everything as much as you can in advance. The bulk of things weren't going to change, but there might be a couple sentences you want to tweak at the 11th hour. So do it all in advance. You can imagine how things are going to go and what's going to be ahead of you. So plan it, and then, any kind of course correct, you can pull that off at the last minute.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what Jeff said about working your plan. But in order to do that, you have to have a plan, but also to be nimble enough to understand what you're experiencing from donors, how they're responding to messaging, all of those pieces, and also what's ever changing in the environment as well. So you've modeled that really well. Thank you for explaining what your process has been, for sure. Okay, Jeff, I'm gonna send this one to you.
Okay.
It says we are 100% donor funded, and some donors seem to be concerned in holding their funds closer to the vest at this time. What's a
Mhm.
good strategy besides not panicking?
Continue to work your plan. I say this over and over again. We can't control this. You can't control like a donor, like whatever reason it is, a donor's feeling like they may not have the funds like they thought they would. This happens quite a bit. That's not the nonprofit's fault or the major gift officer's fault if they give less this year, but you can only do what you can do, and that is work your plan with your donor. And you don't change the relationship, meaning like, well, they can't give that 100,000. I'm not going to try to have coffee with them then. It's not worth it. No, these donors, you need to treat these donors the same because when things do turn around and things get better for that donor, they will remember that. And how you treat and care for donors in times when they're feeling vulnerable financially will be remembered by those donors.
Yeah, that's so important. Autumn, have you had any experiences with your donors that are reaching back out to you to say, hey, right now it feels a little tight or uncertain for me as well? And how have you walked that through?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big concern for me right now. And back to, the question about fatigue, fatigue's part of it, but it's also just how the economy is right now. And in my current role, I deal with donors giving, less than $5,000 a year. And it's the annual fund donors who often get hit the hardest in these economic times. So I am very aware that we could see a drop in revenue this year. And I've tried to communicate that as well as I can to, our finance team every time we do budgets and forecasts to tell them like, this is a huge amount of risk right now.
Mm-hmm.
If folks can't afford eggs, they have to make some really hard decisions about which
Mm-hmm.
nonprofits they're able to fund, if any. And what I always do is lean into identifying the donors who you're their like one of the top three nonprofits. So not everyone is going to give to us this year, but the ones who were their top choice, like we're going to spend our time messaging them. So making sure they have enough opportunities to give, making sure they know, what their support does, is critical. And I think also one of the things I wish I did more of during the pandemic, but unfortunately is going to be really timely now, is talking about how much things cost for nonprofits too. With tariffs coming up, we in fundraising in the States, we get our paper from Canada. That means fundraising costs go through the roof. So actually being able to quantify what's changing for the nonprofit and being able to explain that, that's one of my goals this year for doing a better job of this time. Because we feel it as much, as these donors do. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
just being clear about what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
understanding, when folks need to give less, obviously just coming at it from best practices in donor relationship. It's all about the long term for our donor relationship, for our organization's health. All of it is the long game.
Good.
Yeah.
So this one's a little tricky, this question. Also, the answer might be quite nuanced. We'll start with you, Jeff. There's a few questions that are related to language and messaging around missions that may be particularly of target, especially in the US right now. So if you
Mm-hmm.
have a mission that may be serving communities that may be particularly in the spotlight or target for this administration and what's going on in the world, how have you thought about that messaging? Are we adjusting messaging? Are we, how do we think about staying true to our mission, but also still realizing the threat and fear that may be included in this time?
I mean, I think it's kind of depends on the nonprofit, the leadership of the nonprofit, the board, how they view this. You could look at some organizations. namely like some universities that might be stepping back and changing some of their stuff so that um, funding still comes in. And then you look at like Harvard, who's just been in the news today or yesterday. It's like, no, we're not changing what we're doing. And because one, it's probably illegal, but you know what I mean? It's like you have to decide that from your own organization. Um, and then once you do, then that's where you go. I mean, obviously, my personal opinion might be different than some organization's actions. And yes, if you have a mission and you're really bold about that mission, stay with it and do it. And you know, you have to live with the ramifications. But I can't answer that for someone else, you
Yeah.
know, and there could be a greater good beyond that. If we just tweak this a little bit, we can still get, you know what I mean? So, um, I know it's difficult.
It is difficult. No easy answers for that, piece for that question for sure. But thanks for being willing to wrestle with it a bit. I mean, that's part of what today is about. These are, it's all uncertain, and we're doing our best to navigate it, have a plan in place, and be nimble. All the things we've talked about. So, there's another question here, and Autumn, this may be something you could speak to, or Jeff for sure. This person says they're new to fundraising and supporting an effort to get sponsors for a nonprofit conference. I've reached out to businesses, though having a tough time right now with businesses. And so what are other ideas, in this time when maybe even businesses are feeling what you said, those tariffs are coming into play, everyone's sort of tightening their belt a bit. What are some other ideas when you're thinking about that space of sponsorship?
Great question. Jeff, do you want to start, or do you want me
No, you can
to?
go ahead.
Okay, great. What I would say is really lean into like a volunteer group. The trouble, so what I've always experienced is that when the economy gets rough, businesses and corporations are the first to kind of step back from giving.
Hmm.
But personal connections can make all the difference. So if you are kind of going at these places cold, you could have varying success. Cold calling is less common now in fundraising than it used to be. And so I would lean on other folks in your community. Is there anyone else who is really passionate about this mission who you can tap into and talk to them about who their network is and what their connections are? Or is there a cafe you go to every day that you know the barista there? Start with those warmer connections first and see who else you can tap to kind of help in that too, because fundraising is kind of a community effort. It does take a lot of folks, so you don't have to go it alone. And if you don't know folks to kind of tap into, I'd also recommend looking at kind of your local fundraising groups. So AFP, the Association for Fundraising Professionals, is always a good place to start, but anything else that might be kind of local where you can start making some connections with other fundraising-minded folks would be great as well.
Yep. I don't really have
Okay.
anything to add to that.
It's That's good. Okay, so Autumn, back to you on this. This is a question that came specifically to you. What are some of the ways that you used fresh approaches and language in your outreach to those donors that are giving specifically during this time, that are saying that we want to help, knowing your funding is at risk? What are some of the things that you've done to really steward those donors?
Yeah, great question. So, we are lucky, as I kind of mentioned, we've been working with Veritus to build out a mid-level giving program. So definitely leaning into those relationships. So our mid-level officers have portfolios. So they are proactively going out, and thanking folks, as they always do. But they also are on top of all the information and news. So they can be seen as like additional access to an organization. So donors have really been using them to ask their burning questions. How is how is this really going to affect you? What about my favorite program? All of those good questions. So where you have the personal relationship, absolutely. And then for our membership donors, our annual fund donors, where we may not have them in a portfolio, we communicate them with mass, emails. Is just a lot more communication than we normally do. And we do a lot of communication regularly. But I think for me, one of the things that I appreciate as a donor as well is being kept up to date. Again, I mentioned this newsletter, but
Mm-hmm.
how did you help us in the last 30 days and what's ahead of us so that they know it's not over. It's, at least last week, it wasn't as critical for them to step up, but we are going to need you in the future so that they kind of have that mindset, going into it. They know that the fight isn't over. And then just really leaning into donor relations best practices. So, the thank you calls and texts and acknowledgement letters on time, as you can swing it if things aren't too, overwhelming right now for your nonprofit. Those are, our tried and true tactics. And then in terms of the language that we're using, it's much more specific language than we typically use. KQED is, what's the word I'm looking for? We tend to talk a little more uplifting about the programs and services. So taking a more dire approach is a difference for us. So donors are hearing a different kind of message from us. And I think that's been critical. And encouraging people to support. And it'll be critical going forward and kind of setting the tone and, so people feel what we're feeling internally as well.
Yeah, that transparency, but also picking your moment, right? Picking the moment
Right.
where you ring that bell and say, okay, we really do need everyone to step to the plate and help us make sure that we can ensure our mission is sustained. So that's good. Okay, Jeff, this one's coming to you. Can
Okay.
you walk through some specifics in order to create a plan for a small organization that does not have a fundraising or communications team? Maybe small but mighty.
Well, I think, if you're a one-person shop, let's just say, you only have so much time. You have to figure out of your time that you're developing, and I don't know what the organization is or how many donors they have, or if they have no donors. You have to be able to carve out what part of your time is going to be devoted to new donor acquisition and cultivating lower dollar donors. What about mid-level? What about major gifts? Looking at, you start with your donor file and really look at your current donor assets to know what donors do we have that are large donors or small donors, so that you can figure out what percentage of your time you can devote to each segments of those. And then it's a matter of developing a plan for them. Obviously our lower dollar donors, you will have more of those. You're talking to them in a manner of one to many, in a sense. You're reaching out to them, talking about all the good things you're doing, but it's more generic in the sense of this is what we all do and we need your help kind of thing. And then as they're giving more, moving up that donor pipeline, you're starting to talk to them more specifically about some of the things that they actually within the organization are really keyed in on, and developing communications around that. And then, of course, on a one-to-one basis, you're really trying to figure out what's that donor's passions and interests as it relates to all the specific programs and projects you have, and really developing offers around those areas. But to do that, you have to be able to carve your time out correctly, because there's all kinds of things coming at you, and realize, you can only do what you can do. But having a plan for all of that is really important so you can direct your time correctly. Otherwise, In my experience, for people who have one person who's doing it all, they're only putting out fires all the time. They're only going to what's urgent. They're not thinking about how you're building this and building the relationships long term. And so having a plan really helps you focus correctly so that you're not just putting out fires and running to the next thing, but that you actually have a roadmap for what you're trying to do with your donor base.
You bet. Good. Okay. Autumn, you mentioned you've had some experience with uncertain times and can lean on some of that experience in this current moment. Can you talk a little bit about what you feel like you're taking from that previous learning and applying to today?
Definitely. Honestly, my first reaction was, oh no, I can't believe I have to do this again. Like, I'll be real with you. And it was disappointing and frustrating. And it was hard. Um, but ultimately, um, you know, after I got upset and vented for a bit, I knew the only way I could get through was just by going through it and making a plan. So, I had already kind of seen it play out full circle. Um, and I knew what worked for me the first time. Um, and so I was able to be a little more, looking for a good word here, but I wasn't as concerned about the alternative of, not doing fundraising. So I think the first time I went through it, I weighed a lot of pros and cons. What's the right time? Is this too much? Is this the right moment? Am I gonna get, you know, some negative attention from this? But having gone through it before and having seen like the worst case scenarios play out, I was able to say, I think we should fundraise. It's possible we could get this negative attention, but we should do it anyway because it's critical.
Yeah.
Fundraising is, down for a lot of folks. And we're not anticipating seeing, any of the really strong giving that we saw during COVID. Things are much more touch and go right now. So that for me was critical to make sure when our moment came that we would be ready for it. And we can't just assume that folks are going to step up how they did in the past. We've got to capture that moment. We have to be really timely. It has to follow the news cycle. There are so many other critical, issues right now that if one thing comes up, we may not get that opportunity again. So just, being ready to jump on something. So, not to harp on the plan too much, but, that's really the way I got through my annoyance at having to deal with it again, was just create the plan, create, the worst and best case scenarios in my head so that I could communicate it to the execs, and they had a full picture of what we were getting into as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important. I think it leans right into this next question I want to pose to both of you, and probably our final question for today. So this person says, this seems like a time when a culture of philanthropy is needed more than ever, and impressing on everyone in the organization that they may have relationships or ideas about potential donors or revenue opportunities. Can you talk about how to convey this throughout an organization?
Well, I mean, hopefully you're doing this all the time. Trying to build a culture of philanthropy is something you do every day. It's not something, oh, well, this month we're going to build a culture of philanthropy. But it's really educating, it's helping everyone in the organization understand the role of your donors, the role of staff, the role of the community, all working together to make this thing work. And that means that you're constantly talking about that. It's like do your finance people really understand what you're trying to do? And if they don't, how can you help them understand what you do? How can they be walking in your shoes? Probably be walking in their shoes as well. So it's one of those things that if the organization is proactive about that, times like these that are uncertain is much easier to deal with organizationally, because then everyone's like, oh yeah, we know what we have to do. Finance is like, yep, I'm going to get you those numbers. That gap number you need, I'll have it to you tomorrow. Why? Because you've already had these conversations about what you're all trying to do together. So building that culture of philanthropy within an organization is absolutely critical, especially during this time. And I mean, if you haven't built that, this is one time to be able to a catalyst to start that. Like we all got to come together here and use it as the starting point for, oh yeah, when we had that crisis, or remember when that economic downturn came, everyone came together. And that was the start of our organization really understanding how this all works.
That's right. Autumn, anything you want to add there?
Well, I can't beat that because Jeff is absolutely correct there. But I will just say, also don't be afraid to share bad news with folks in your organizations.
Yes.
You didn't meet your budget goal this past month. Like, you can be transparent about that. You can tell them you're concerned about the economy and increasing costs, and you're going to monitor the situation, and you're doing your best. I think letting people into the good and the challenging is really critical in times like these, and all the time, honestly.
That's good advice, Autumn, and a good note to end on in terms of making sure that everybody in your organization is, understanding what's ahead, right? We're all being transparent, not only with our donors, but internally with what's happening. So I want to thank you.
I think it also would be good just hearing all the chats and the webinars. Thanks for everyone for helping each other out. We need to do this again in a couple of months or so and see where people are at. But I love the idea of being able to come together, all different types of fundraisers from all different organizations, and kind of working as a community to help each other out during this time. So I'm really happy that all of you on the chats are participating and seeking out advice from each other. That's what this is about. So thanks for being here.
That's right. Thank you so much. And thanks, Autumn, for joining us. I know some of you were asking me in the question box about our other panelists. Unfortunately, she had a little bit of technical difficulty, but hopefully we can have her on a future call to talk a little bit of about the impact in the healthcare industry for sure. So thank you for being with us. Be on the lookout for an email tomorrow with the link to today's recording so that you can rewatch and share with others. We really appreciate you spending this time with us today, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Good luck all.
Thank you. See you.